my talk talking about fiscal sustainability, but before I get into that, I'd like to say briefly where the United States is on service performance reporting. At the state and local government level, we have guidance that's issued by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board in the U.S., and that's widely used across the state and local government community. In the federal government, we have actually statutory requirements. Every agency is required to prepare a strategic plan, and it's published for the public to read, and includes goals, objectives, performance measures, performance targets, and then annually at the end of the year they have another report which assesses their progress against those goals, objectives, and using those measures. And so it's an important part of our performance monitoring process in the federal government. And interestingly, that follow-up report, which talks about where things have gone for the year, is in one of two places. It's either included in the document that includes the agency's financial statements, or it's included in the budget submission. In either case, giving valuable information to the decision makers to think about when they're passing the budget or when they're reviewing the financial statements. Now I'd like to talk about fiscal sustainability and a practical application and how we are using it in the United States. We have been reporting for several years now long-term fiscal sustainability information in our financial statements. It's in an unaudited section at the moment, and I'll talk about that. But importantly, it's very consistent with the new RPG. In fact, when we were developing them at the same time virtually in the United States for our standards as the SASB was. And so there's a great correlation between them, and I think they're highly consistent. So what I'll talk about is again, a live example of implementation and walk you through some of the things that we encountered when we were trying to develop a standard in the U.S. for reporting this information. When we started, though, down on fiscal sustainability, we started looking around and saying, well, what have we done in the past? We got to the fiscal sustainability because it was clear that our balance sheets and our historic financial statements were really not providing the kind of information we needed to understand whether or not we were going to be able to keep providing the services we were providing in the long term, whether we could afford to do so, and what actions we might need to take to address it if we can't. And we got into the fiscal sustainability as an avenue, and we started actually with our social insurance. Our two major social insurance programs, Social Security and Medicare, we've had fiscal sustainability projections for those programs at the program level for quite a number of years. In 2006, we actually made them a principal statement in the financial statements and subject to audit. And before that, we had it in the unaudited section again for several years. And interestingly enough, actually, when they started those programs back in 1940s for Social Security and 1960s for Medicare, they actually set up trustees and required fiscal sustainability reporting on those programs annually since that point in time. So we've had decades of history with social insurance in the United States being reported separately. We've now moved that into the financial statement process because we felt it was an important part of the information that users of the financial statement should have. With that, we thought about it some more and decided, well, we really aren't getting the full picture. We've got a good information for social insurance, but what about the government as a whole? And so we developed a standard generally consistent with the RPG at SASB that basically said we're going to have a statement that will become audited, and it will become audited in 2015, next year. But we've been presenting it as unaudited information since 2010. Basically, it has the present value of expected or projected receipts and non-interest spending over a horizon of 75 years. Now, how do we pick 75 years? I can't tell you the answer to that exactly. We started with that in the social insurance arena. We carried that forward because, as you'll see in a few minutes, a great part of our sustainability is really dependent upon the social insurance, and so it's an important area. It also assumes current policy without change. That was one of the hardest things we had to deal with, is making it current policy. What does that mean? What do you do if you have annual appropriations? Well, we decided that meant you assume those programs keep going. You provide the level of services you've been providing. How much is that going to cost you? So forth and so on. What happens if you have limitations? In other words, what happens if you have a program that is a single source of funding, and if the funding runs out, you'll have to cut the benefits? Well, we decided, no, we want to measure what it would cost us to keep providing the services we're providing today and whether we can afford it. So we decided, no, we'll ignore certain barriers there that by law would happen just to see what it looks like when we're projecting this information. We also had an interesting format because we had two subgroups. We had one that was the technical group and one that was a communications group, because we felt it important to be able to communicate very technical information to the citizenry and the broad community. So basically, we had a big discussion. Do we want to present this as a percent of GDP, or gross domestic product, or in dollars? And I think we decided we needed both, because some groups thought one was more important than the other and vice versa. So it's presented both in dollars and in percent of GDP. And we also wanted to highlight what are the significant changes from year to year, and those are presented. As I said, that will be audited starting in 2015. In addition, we have requirements for a robust set of disclosures as well, in addition to the actual financial statement. So our notes would display information on fiscal gap, and that's a very technical term, and I'm not sure I will get you fully there today, but basically it's how much do I need to change my receipts or non-interest spending over time in order to keep my debt within a particular target. Now, in our case, we don't have a policy on what our debt level should be. Right at the end of last year, it was 72% of GDP. So we decided at FASAB that we will use as a target whatever we started with at the beginning of the year. So we tried to measure how much do we need to change things just to stay where we are. Of course, we need more if we decided we wanted to lower that debt to GDP ratio. It's also important to be very transparent about the assumptions that were included in this, because there are some significant assumptions, and reasonable people might have different views on what they would like to have in the way of assumptions. But the key was they had to be reasonable assumptions given the facts and circumstances and economics and demographics and so forth and so on. And we wanted to narratively discuss what really changed from year to year. For example, if we pass legislation, and that happened last year actually in 2013, we had the American Taxpayer Relief Act, which didn't extend tax cuts to the wealthier individuals in the United States. And that basically increased our revenues and decreased our long-term fiscal sustainability by about $3 trillion or so. So it really measures the impact of that legislation or other changes that have an impact on the government. We also wanted to disclose what are the significant departures. That's what I talked about before. You know, if there's a limitation there on our debt limit, we have a debt limit theory we cannot exceed, so we kind of ignore that for purposes of this illustration. We want to make sure people understand that. And what are the limitations? There's a whole set of required disclosures in our standard that basically try to inform the reader that this is not a forecast. We're not saying this is where the government will go. As you'll see these numbers, I'm hoping that's not where our government will go. I don't think they will. But it's an exercise to see what would happen if we continued on the current course. We also have a category in the United States, which I think is fairly unique. It's called required supplemental information. And basically, it's unaudited, but the auditor does have to perform certain procedures. They have to read it. They have to make sure it's consistent with the statements. And they have to see if it's presented in the format and the content requirements of the standard setter. So basically, we have a number of things in the supplemental information. One is what is the history and what's the projected cash flows. So our statement just shows the bottom line numbers, the present value over 75 years. We wanted to show how that changed over time. Was it all in the end, was it in the beginning, or how did the cash flows work out? Because we felt the timing of those was important as the bottom line. Also, what does the debt look like? When we talk about sustainability in the United States, we're saying sustainability is where the level of debt to GDP is either stable or declining over time. And we wanted to see what does it look like if we continue our current policies. We also wanted to have alternative scenarios. Now, what that's happened to play out is really a sensitivity analysis. And some of the most significant factors and assumptions that go into the models, we have a sensitivity analysis so the user can look at those and see, well, if I wanted to make some changes to this, what kind of impact would that have on the bottom line? And the other issue was in the United States, obviously, one of the questions came up is, well, doesn't this problem really get worse in a few years from now? And the answer is yes, it gets worse because our population is aging, and yes, because our healthcare costs are growing in excess of GDP. But nonetheless, how much would it cost if we didn't make any policy actions for a while? So we wanted to make it clear that there is a significant cost if we don't take action soon. This is probably a little hard to read up there, but basically wanted to give you an idea of what our statement actually looks like. This is a one-year presentation. In reality, it's a two-year presentation with a column for changes, so it's about 6 columns wide. And I didn't want to present all that. That was next to impossible to put on the slide. So I tried to put just 1 year to give you some idea. If you look at the first few lines there, a couple of lines, you'll see our Social Security and Medicare revenues, and then in the lower part you'll see the non-interest spending, and gives you some idea. The bottom line is that our estimates show that in present value terms, we're about $4 trillion short of breaking even, if you will, in terms of cash flows. That doesn't mean our debt's not going up, because this is non-interest spending. I'll get into fiscal gap in a moment, because we actually have to make a slight primary surplus in order to pay down the existing debt and debt service. But it gives you some idea of the kind of numbers that we're looking at, and basically another requirement that we had was we have certain programs, our Social Security and hospitalization for Medicare are funded by dedicated payment streams, which in theory, if we run out of money, we can't pay full benefits. And so another disclosure that's interesting is that those two programs are in a combined deficit of about $18.5 trillion as of the end of last year, and that's offset by general revenue funded programs, which have a surplus of about 14.5, netting to the $4 trillion there. So it's interesting when you look at the analysis too about where that is coming from. But it does give an idea of, are the general revenues sufficient to support the programs that are designed to be supported by general revenues? This is, again, all these examples are out of our financial statements, and this is the historical and projected cash flows. You'll see back in 2008 or 9, we had a slight spike there where our costs went way up and our revenue went way down, and that shows up there. And going forward, you'll see the total receipts line and just above it the non-interest spending line are separated by a small amount, but they continue on even past this graph. In the infinite horizon, the gap continues to increase. But you'll see the interest part, which is really, I know as one of our former Controller General, David Walker, said, it's compounding interest, but only in the wrong direction. Because if we're not paying off our debt and we're borrowing to pay the interest, our interest costs continue to escalate as an actual amount. We would pay substantial amounts of interest in the future, and this is assuming that we would be paying at relatively current interest rates, which probably wouldn't happen if our debt goes up like the next slide will show. This is the what if. What happens if we actually did this and we had those cash flows that you just saw in the graph, and this shows that our debt to the public would increase substantially over time, and in effect, as I said before, with our definition, we're not sustainable. Our current policy cannot be sustained. There needs to be some change or action taken to deal with it. We also wanted to look at the cost of delay. This is just some information, and essentially it goes up. You see at the bottom 17, 21, or excuse me, 1.7, 2.1, 2.6. Those are the percentages it would go up if we delayed 10-year increments. And so it gives you some idea of the magnitude of the increase, and that's as a percent of GDP expressed in that manner. This is another slide. I apologize. It's a little small. I guess you can hopefully see it up there. But in the end of the day, our fiscal gap indicates that we would need to either increase receipts and or decrease spending by about 1.7% of GDP in order to keep our debt at its current level. And again, more if we wanted to reduce it in any way. But this is a sensitivity analysis which shows what are the primary drivers. So if you look at the first section there, it's really the increase in healthcare cost. It has a substantial effect on these estimates. If you look up there, you'll see that basically excuse me a second. There we go. If you look up here, our base assumption is that healthcare costs grow at GDP plus 0.2%. That is optimistic because it's grown a lot faster than that over time, historically. So if one assumed it was just 1 percentage point higher, it goes up 4.7 to 4.7%, or an increase of 3 percentage points. And if you look at the bottom, the percentage point is about $10.9 trillion. So we're talking substantial change if, in fact, as a matter of policy, we can't control those costs or make policy decisions that we need to have additional funding to cover them. So that gives you some idea of how we're using these numbers in our actual reports in the U.S. That's a lot of information to probably digest in the few minutes I had up here, but I just wanted to give you a broad overview, and then hopefully the gentlemen and yourselves will have some questions. We'll try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience, Bob. What I found personally particularly interesting, maybe because of where I'm coming from, is your concern actually to communicate with citizens. I think that's really key, because at the end of the day, this is really a matter of democratic accountability. So thank you very much for that. Jan, I told you you'd had a chance actually to ask a question to Bob. So is there anything you would like to probe him on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've focused on the actual sort of reporting side of things thus far, and that's certainly obviously what we're focusing on in Recommended Practice Guideline 1. One of the things that certainly we had some debate about was the assurance side and how you might approach that, and I wondered whether you could talk a bit about that. What sort of challenges has that raised, and how have you approached that?
Okay. Yeah, we first encountered this actually when we started to do our statement of social insurance. The board had concerns about, is it auditable? Similarly, there were 75-year projections with very extensive economic demographic assumptions built in. And we went to our AICPA, and there was a task force formed, and there was actually a guidance issued that talked about how you would go about auditing those, what is the criteria you would use, what would you be looking for and at. One of the biggest issues, obviously, was the assumptions, you know, and one of the criteria was that they had to be reasonable. We started off with best available, but that created some problems because there was always an argument, well, if you spent more, you could probably get better information, but there's some diminishing returns. And so we said, no, it had to be a reasonable estimate, and that was very important part of that. So we developed the guidance, and we've been applying that since, I said, 2006 for social insurance. And we anticipate the same guidance, we plan to use that same guidance to audit sustainability. As the numbers showed, a significant part of our overall relates to the social insurance programs. For the other ones, we have various assumptions there about how we might grow those costs. The discretionary historically has tended to grow with inflation, and so the estimates would project that. And so we look at what's the basis, what has history been, are there trends currently? We have on staff, you talked about skills, we have actuaries, economists, mathematicians, and a whole source of people there that we use that are on our staff to look at these. So it's not just the financial auditor coming in and doing the audit, it's a whole team that works very closely together in a very matrixed fashion to audit these. So it's a very multidisciplinary audit, much different than the historical statements. But it's something I think has worked well for social insurance, and I expect will work well for the full fiscal sustainability.
Thank you, Bob. I think we have plenty of time for questions, actually. Maybe if that's because the three of you are speaking in your native language and speaking quite quickly. So I think we're ahead of schedule, which is good. Ken, maybe you have time for a question to Bob as well?
Well, I guess one quick question after we go past the assurance, it's then out to the public. What are the sort of communication efforts and what sort of impact have you seen from these reports in terms of the public discourse and the public debate?
Well, that's interesting. That leads me right into one other thing I brought with me. This is a Citizen's Guide, which is about 8 pages, which is really designed to provide all of our financial statements, but about half of it relates to sustainability information, which shows some of the same charts and graphs which I showed you up there. So our intent is to communicate that clearly to the citizens, and I think it has had a significant impact. If you go back a couple of years, maybe three years or so, there was a whole commission set up because the president was using basically the sustainability information projections and saying we can't do this, we need to come up with something, and they had proposed potential policy changes that could be implemented to narrow the gap. So we were using that type of information. Unfortunately, we couldn't get legislation enacted to move those, and so we ended up with what we call sequestration, which was a mandatory cut. But nonetheless, if you look through, even the Republican Party in the House had put together their budget plan, and it started with sustainability type information and modified it for policy changes they thought were appropriate and what the impact would be. So I think we're clearly seeing it more often used as a policy analysis tool.